What are the odds that China invades Taiwan?
Fairly low. Let's assume for the moment that the Chinese could pull it off. If you get the semiconductor fab facilities, they don't know how to operate them, so they would just be dead letters. In addition, you would have a lot of global action. One of the big disappointments the Chinese have had with the Ukraine war is that everything that they thought was true for the last 40 years has now been proven wrong. They've always known that taking Taiwan would be harder than Russia taking Ukraine because, there's not a land border, it's not flat, there's a moat. They thought that the world would do nothing. And if you take the sanctions that the world has put on Russia and put them on China, oh my God. The Russian economy isn't great, but it is a massive exporter of energy products and food products. China is the world's largest importer of both of those. So you put a similar lockdown on the Chinese system, you're talking about famine in under a year, not to mention a complete industrial collapse. So every plan, diplomatically, strategically, militarily, that the Chinese have been gaming out for a generation, they now know are completely wrong. And this would be the point where normally you would take your smart people and put them in a back room with some beer and some pizza and say, don't come out until I have a plan B. But Xi has shot all those people. So normally, I would say the chances are zero. But if we're moving into an environment where the Chinese are facing simultaneous agricultural, health, population, and energy collapses, assuming the Americans do nothing, there is something to be said for choosing the time and the place of a patriotic war in order to write the narrative. And if that allows the CCP to remain in power for the low, low price of 700 million dead Chinese, well then okay. So I give it like a 1 in 4 chance. The biggest impact by far for climate shifts isn't going to be in your industry, in my opinion. It's going to be in agriculture. Because if you move the bands where you can grow certain crops, if there's no population or infrastructure where the bands move to, oops, this is a real big problem in the subcontinent, in the Russian wheat belt, and in China specifically. Those are the places where climate is most exposed to potential changes, and crops are monocultured in high concentrations in very specific climate bands where if they move, you just can't grow it there. So yeah, we're definitely looking at a big problem there. I also don't think that we're going to see the energy transition, though, that is necessary to deal with it. Let me deal with that from 2 points of view. Number one, the technology is not sufficiently mature, in my opinion, to be applied in most places. Solar and wind only work over about 5% of the Earth's surface. It would be about 15% of the global land surface. And for most countries, that is not where the people actually live. So it works in Texas. Dallas-Fort Worth is at the edge of the solar zone. It's at the heart of the wind zone. It will probably be the first major metropolis in the United States to go 100% green, not because there are environmentalists in Texas, but because Texans can do math and they like free. Omaha will probably be second. Denver will probably be third. You can't do that in Europe. You can't do that in China. And don't get me started on EVs. I'm a big fan of things with few moving parts, but that has to apply to the supply chains to make it too. And the lithium comes from one place, and it's all processed in China. So just building the alternate processing infrastructure, and by the way, we'll have to invade Russia too, just to get the materials to do EVs at scale is just laughable for the next decade. We need a new technological series of breakthroughs in material science before that is possible.
What contribution do you see from the African continent in terms of global manufacturing horsepower?
Very little. Africa is a series of stacked plateaus, so just getting the infrastructure in there to access anything is very difficult. And while they do have very high birth rates and a more stable population structure, a lot of that is only possible because they export raw commodities and then import the things that allow them to have a degree of modernity. You break down global supply chains, a lot of that goes away. And so I think a lot of Africa is going to devolve. And they just don't have the infrastructure or the skilled labor that's necessary to participate at scale. And even if they did, in a less robust security environment, the connections necessary to make that happen are going to be very thin. So I think it's far more likely that the North American manufacturing system will start incorporating pieces of South America. We already have free trade deals with Colombia and Chile, for example. But yeah, I'm afraid that Africa really can't be part of that. Now, we might see pieces of Africa following the Indian model. I can see Nigeria becoming broadly self-sufficient. I can see a partial reboot of South Africa, but that's for their own domestic markets rather than any sort of international connection. Our manufacturing in a value-added sense is the top in the world still. And I see no reason for that to fail. My biggest concerns are things that are attached to semiconductors that are in that kind of middle tier. We can do without the singing refrigerator. So the low-end chips, we'll have to get used to actually hitting buttons. as opposed to telling Siri to do something, I think we're going to live with that. But in the middle, the stuff that goes into middle manufacturing, into aerospace, into automotive, that's where the shortage is going to be. So I see us having to build our own damn phones. Now, that's going to take a few years to build out the infrastructure. So if you have an iPhone right now, the new model that's coming out, that's the last one. It's going to take them at least 5 years to rebuild that supply chain. 94% of the parts come from mainland China. That just goes away. We'll still have the chips, that's the hard part, but we're going to have to rebuild that somewhere else. On the low end, we're actually really good at that. Our energy and labor situation is so robust that we've become the world's primary heavy industry producer, especially in petrochem. You throw in Mexico, that's the middle of the stuff. So it's the things that plug in that make it problematic. Now, this means that we can go through it. That means we can now use network effects. And especially in the Texas-Mexico fusion, it looks really promising. But getting from here to there, that's a 5-year process. Unfortunately, Americans don't like to build out new industrial plant until the shortage is already here. And that's the environment that we're in today.
Can you elaborate on the opportunities in the Texas Triangle and the potential growth in northern Mexico?
The Texas Triangle is the part of the United States that is likely to experience the fastest economic growth for the next 30 or 35 years. You've got the population centers, you've got a port, you've got a financial center, you've got low, mid, and complex manufacturing all in one place. You plug in the Mexicans to that, they're already plugged into it. The biggest limitation we have right now is infrastructure, and you have all seen the traffic. There's no quick fix for that, but you've been working on it for 30 years, you're going to be working on it for another 30 years. And if you are talking about the United States needing to double its industrial plant, I figure at least a third of that is going to happen here. Biggest challenge is going to be capital. Texas has cheap land, cheap power, cheap food. That's part of the draw. Low taxes, capital. With the baby boomers going away, we have to do all of this in an environment of constrained capital and constrained labor. And one of the things we are going to see is that Texas' success is going to hoover up labor from the rest of the country. That didn't matter 15 years ago because there was plenty of labor everywhere. Now it's constrained. And a win here now is broadly a loss everywhere else. Now, Texans are like, so? But the political splits we have seen between Texas and everyone else is nothing to what's coming, because we're talking about a Texas that is going to be experiencing economic growth rates of like a Korean scale, while the parts of the country that just can't pull this off are drained. So from my point of view, this is maybe a positive because it means we're going to be arguing about something besides the culture war. We're actually going to argue about something that, in my opinion, matters. But it's going to get ugly because success here is no longer necessarily a driver of success elsewhere. If you border Texas, you get sucked in. That might apply. For those of you who are from Oklahoma, you're becoming a satellite of Texas. The Texans are actually reaching out to you to interface on purpose. This is weird. But the same thing's going to happen to Louisiana. The same thing is going to happen probably to Colorado.